Is there a bias against the historical credibility of the Bible? And if so, why? That was the question I was interested in learning more about when I traveled to the seaport of Bristol, England, to meet with Old Testament scholar John Bimson on the grounds of Trinity College.
There's a lot of inconsistency, I think, in the way ancient texts are approached, and the Bible seems to come in for an undue level of skepticism which isn't applied to the other texts.
Well, then why is there such skepticism about the Bible and its history?
When it comes to the conquest, I think there are two reasons for it. One is because the Old Testament tells the story of Israel from a deeply theological perspective, always saying how God has worked in this history. People assume there can't be genuine, straightforward history in there as well. But that's, I think, a false dichotomy, this split between theology and history.
Do other texts get the same treatment?
Well, no, they tend to be, they're not treated with the same bias as the Bible, to be honest. We have plenty of ancient texts which contain theology as well as history, and they don't get dismissed or given the same level of skepticism. They're assumed to be innocent till proved guilty, whereas the Bible tends to be assumed to be guilty until it's proved innocent. A good example would be the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. We know that he fought the Hittites at a place called Kadesh, and we have both Egyptian and Hittite references to this event.
So there's a historical
So we know it's a historical event, and yet the Egyptian account of it is Ramesses talking about how he prayed to the god Ammon and how the god Ammon answered his prayer in the course of the battle. So it's a theological account, but it's dealing with an event that we know was a historical event.
But that is considered acceptable, whereas the conquest is actually...
Yes, there's a tendency to apply much, much higher criteria of proof, if you like, to the Bible than to these other texts that ancient historians and archaeologists use all the time.
John, you mentioned that there is another reason for skepticism in the Bible.
Yes, that's chiefly to do with the lack of any clear archaeological evidence for a conquest. The reason for that is that people have been looking for this evidence in the 13th century BC, the 1200s, and it isn't there. There's no evidence of a wave of destructions of cities within a short period of time. But my view is that the reason that evidence is lacking is because that isn't the right century to be looking. I don't think the Exodus and the conquest happened in the 13th century. The Bible's own clues as to when it might have happened point to a date about 2 centuries earlier. Well, do come inside.
Why do you think that solving the question of the biblical story is important?
I think so much of the theological message of the Bible is intertwined with its historical narrative. I think if you took away the historical basis, then you've really deprived it of a lot of its theological truth. So much of what the Old Testament says about the character of God and his purposes in calling Israel are intertwined with this story of this people coming out of Egypt and entering the Promised Land. So history and theology are tightly intertwined in the Bible. The way one writer has put it is clumsy, but I think memorable, that the having happenedness of the biblical narrative matters. And so being able to point to ways in which the biblical narrative can be correlated with archaeology is one way of giving extra strength to the historicity of the narrative, because the having happenedness matters.
In my hometown, I went to see Charles Ayling and Clyde Billington and asked a similar question related to the bias against the Bible.
Well, I think time after time, when you actually look at the historical evidence, it's very clear that the Bible knows what it's talking about in very minute detail. And we could give you a lot of examples of that, and we've given you some already related to the Exodus. People say the Bible is false, and yet oftentimes they don't even actually look at the real archaeological evidence that's available.
I think that the big thing to remember is that a lot of people don't want to find the Exodus. They really don't, because it would link up too much to the Bible being true and demanding changes in the way people live. I think it's a heart problem as well as a head problem.
Mansour Barak explained that there was a tension between science and what he called the fanatics of what people believed, whether this was for or against the Bible's narrative of a historical Exodus event.
You know, people, they don't like to speak about Exodus. Don't know why. Because, in my opinion, that everybody is fanatic in what he believes. And this is not good for the science. We need to speak scientifically. Scientifically, you have to open your mind to all the opinion and read it by yourself. Don't let anybody affect in what you believe. But also, on the other hand, you have to accept the other opinion. Your opinion are not always the right opinion. You have to accept the other opinion. And debate with me, discuss. Yeah. You can convince me, or shall I convince you? But without judging on me that you are right and I am wrong. No. Leave it to the public to judge. We have a myth, we have a story. It is in the holy books. Who knows? But don't believe in what you believe on.
Basically, that's exactly what I'm trying to do, is to find out all the different ideas and tell the story. And
if you want to tell a story, you have to have the different ideas. At the end, the audience, the people themselves, they will judge. They will know. But as I said, some people are so fanatic in what they believe. And this is good, not good for the science. You have an evidence, you have to discuss it, you have to compare it, you have to dig here, excavate here, see here what you found here, and do what you call it a research. To do a research, and then you will come with a conclusion. And this conclusion will be in front of the public. The public can judge if you are a scientific man, a logical theory, or you are exaggerating, or you have some story from your own mind.
When I talked with archaeologist Bryant Wood in Pennsylvania, I asked my question about bias against the Bible in a more personal way. Well, what if people looked at your organization or what you're trying to do and say, well, you're biased. Why should we trust Bryant Wood to give us any feedback on this? Why should the audience or others look at what you're saying?
I think everybody in the field of biblical archaeology has a bias, has to do with the historicity of the Bible, whether you think those events really happened or not. And so, yes, this plays into the whole matter of interpreting your evidence. And so those who believe in the accuracy of the Bible will view the evidence differently than somebody who says, well, the Bible is just nothing but folk stories and fairy tales. Chances are they won't even compare the evidence with what the Bible has to say. But in defense of my position, taking the Bible as historically accurate, I cannot make up the evidence. It's what it is. And when archaeologists go there, and they're secular archaeologists, none of them were out to prove that the biblical account is true. They just dug up archaeological information, and I have analyzed it and compared it to the Bible, and I see, wow, it matches exactly. Well, like I say, I didn't make it up. I didn't plant the evidence. So it's there for everybody to look at, and it backs up the Bible. So that's just the way it is. I don't apologize. That's science. Look at your evidence and come to a conclusion based on the evidence. Many other people who don't take the Bible literally have to explain it away somehow. Oh, it was a natural catastrophe. And so I would say, forget about your bias. Look at the evidence. Let the evidence speak. Draw your conclusion from the evidence, not from a preconceived notion that you might have. And that should be the basis for our discussion and dialogue, is looking at the evidence, not what church I go to or what school I was trained at, but what does the evidence say?
Professor James Hoffmeyer sees levels of bias as a swinging pendulum. What's happening now, though, in the trend of scholarship?
Well, I think the trend goes back and forth. How people view the Bible sort of swings back and forth like a pendulum. And we've been on, for the last 30 years, a pretty negative move in what we call the minimalist historical direction, that is, deriving the minimal amount of historical worth or information from the Bible. I think it's gone as far to that direction as it can possibly go, and it's beginning to move back ever so slightly, but I think it is moving back in a more moderate direction.
And you talked about the fact that the criticism of the Bible now is that the Bible has to have a secondary source before they will take any of the information from the Bible. Could we talk about that?
Well, the tendency to hold the Bible to a different standard than other documents is obviously based on the fact that the Bible is not just another historical document. It's not just another ancient document. The Bible still shapes the religious traditions of both Jews and Christians. So I think because of its function in the community of faith, it is viewed with a more skeptical eye than if the Bible, if we had the same Bible but nobody believed Jew or Christian in the message of the Bible, it would not be viewed with the kind of criticism and skepticism it is today.
I asked David Roll to talk about the important consequences of a bias against the Bible as a historical document.
Well, the thing is that history is not the past. The past is what happened. History is our best guess at what happened. And what we use in terms of ancient history to determine what happened and try to interpret it is archaeology. That's our tool that we use. So we dig into the ground, we find objects and texts, and we try to interpret them, construct a history out of that material. But there's also another piece of evidence that we don't use very often, and that's the Old Testament, the Bible. That is a work of history. That is a source for us to interpret what happened in the ancient world. And yet scholars don't use it that way. They don't use it that way because they think it's a work of fiction. They don't actually believe it to have happened, that those stories are not really true. Now, I take a different approach. I say, why not treat the Bible just like any other ancient historical document? We look at it, we read it, we look at what it says, and we try and check it up against the evidence. We try and perform a synthesis between the archaeological evidence and the stories in the Old Testament. And if we find a match, why not accept it and make that history? If we don't find a match, then we can dismiss it. But the fact is, I do find matches. Other people do find matches.
So what you're saying is that there are matches there, but they're being ignored. Is that why this denial of the ancient stories of the Bible is happening?
Scholars can't really avoid this question of whether or not the biblical stories are historical or not. And they've come to the conclusion that they're not. This is most of the scholars, I'm saying, not all, especially the secular scholars, will say that the biblical stories are not true. They're not based on real history, real events. And the reason for that is simply because the archaeologists have not found any corroborative evidence in the ground to confirm those stories. And it's a catch-22 situation. If you have no evidence in the archaeological record, then we're in a situation where you can't really say the stories actually happened. There is archaeological evidence for the later stories of the Old Testament from about the 9th century onwards. Let's say from the reigns of Omri and Ahab, we start to get connections between Assyrian records and the stories in the Bible. So that's okay. But anything before that, there is no real evidence at the moment. And the reason why that is because they've been looking for this evidence in the wrong strata, in the wrong layers at the sites that they're digging. And so you're not going to find evidence in that situation.
And what have you found?
I found, again, this problem is all about time, that they're looking in the right places, at Jericho, at the Eastern Delta in the land of Goshen. They're digging in the right places, but they're not going deep enough to find the Israelites. They're not going early enough in time to find those Israelite occupation levels.
Was there a tendency to want to discredit the Bible in early archaeology in the 1900s?
No, I think that the early days, everybody was genuinely interested in finding evidence for the biblical story and expected to find it. There was no reason why they should not expect to find it. We're talking about a very different period to we are today. Scholars in those days were very Christian, very based on the Bible, and everything was about finding the Bible in the Holy Land and in Egypt. And over the last 200 years, there's a definite, tangible sense of disappointment that they have not found that evidence. That every time they try to confirm this structure, this timeline in the archaeological evidence, they've not found corroborative evidence. So, for instance, when we look at the city of Ramses II's great city, where you would expect to find a large population of Semitic slaves, Israelites if you like, you don't find it.
You don't find it in the city of Ramesses.
No. You don't find those people, those type of people, living in the city of Ramesses. But, and this is the interesting thing, you dig down deeper, lower down, in a slightly different part of the location, but it's still part of Ramesses, the city of Ramesses. You dig down lower down to an earlier level, and we find another city called Avaris, and that city is a vast city, and it's all a Semitic population. So that matches the story of the Bible very well.